A whole bunch of sirens just.
Can you see my screen share?
Yes.
Yes.
But it's playing a little soon, Rachel, so I would stop it and start again now.
Yeah, and Rachel, there's no music. Were you hearing
I'm
the?
sorry, the PowerPoint is not working. I apologize.
Then just put the first screenshot up if you can, and then we'll go right to Leah.
Okay, let's go. Good evening, everybody. We would like to welcome you as you join us for our explorations at the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. I'm Leah Schaefer, Associate Producer of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, now in its 26th year. Our festival theme this year is Polyphonies. We acknowledge that we are mounting this festival and convening our communities together for discussion within contexts beyond Ithaca. We ask you to remember that the 2023 festival takes place as global climate catastrophe intensifies, as the Russian war in Ukraine continues, as polarizations about race, gender, sexualities, nations, politics, land, air, and water deepen across the globe, and as people across the world endure violence and disease, yet continue to fight for democracy, equality, freedom of expression, and a livable planet. Ithaca is located on the traditional homelands of the Gyokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gyokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gyokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gyokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Polyphonies joyously layer different voices, practices, and perspectives across the arts, politics, technologies, and ecologies. Tonight's events are co-sponsored by the Park Center for Independent Media and Ithaca College. We are all very honored that you have joined us this evening for this event. It is with great pleasure that I now introduce this evening's speakers. Claire Gleitman, Dean, Ithaca College School of Humanities and Sciences, Amy Louise Wood, Illinois State University and Fellow at the National Humanities Center, Carol Emberton, Professor of History, University of Buffalo, and our featured author, Michael Ayers Trotti, Professor of History at Ithaca College. Welcome.
Welcome, faculty, students, alumni, and guests to this joyous event where together we will be celebrating and diving into Michael Trotti's fascinating new book, which I am proudly holding in my hand, The End of Public Execution, Race, Religion, and Punishment in the American South. As Leah mentioned, tonight's event is hosted by the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival and by the Park Center for Independent Media. As many of you know, FLEF and PCIM are interdisciplinary organizations that serve all of Ithaca College through innovative programming that brings people from different disciplines together to talk about ideas that matter. FLEF has been in existence and galvanizing us, in Jane Fonda's words in a recent tribute to FLEF, for 26 years, and PCIM has been around for 14. Both are housed in the Roy H. Park School, but they serve the college, the region, the nation, and the globe by providing space for urgent, far-ranging conversations between scholars, writers, filmmakers, artists, and thinkers of all categories. One component of this important work has involved convening conversations about new books by the IC faculty as a way of making visible the scholarly work in which our faculty is vigorously engaged and their vital contributions to the intellectual discourse in their disciplines and beyond them. We all owe a huge debt of gratitude to FLEF under the devoted leadership of Professor Patty Zimmerman and PCIM for their tireless commitment to heralding the achievements of IC's world-class faculty. Speaking of world-class faculty, I consider it my very great good fortune to have known Michael Trotti for over 2 decades now, and to have worked with him in a variety of capacities, including on the H&S Faculty Senate, which Michael led with admirable acuity and discernment during the years when it was still a fledgling committee. Michael played an instrumental role in helping to shape the Senate into the remarkably functional faculty governance body that it is today. As a campus leader, Michael is uniquely thoughtful, balanced, and humane. He's someone you really want to talk things through with because of his ability to see a problem from multiple angles, to avoid dogmatism, to think with the kind of suppleness and flexibility that can bring a group of people with different mindsets to a surprising and satisfying consensus. That's a rare gift in our fractious times. It's that same suppleness of thought that characterizes Michael's cogent new book, which explores a horrific, deeply painful topic unflinchingly, but also with a moving hopelessness, one that is not naive, about the possibility that our children might yet, in his words, inherit from us a better world, excuse me. To say more about Michael's book, I'm going to turn things over to Amy Wood.
Thank you. Thank you, and I'm honored to be kicking off this conversation, and congratulations to Michael for this achievement. I want to use my time to talk about why this book is important, and I think it's pretty important. It's about the transition from public executions when men and some women were put to death before large crowds to private executions which were conducted behind enclosures and eventually prison walls. This was a significant transition in the history of capital punishment that happened nationwide throughout the 19th century, but it came later in the South during the Jim Crow era. So why this book is important. One, we don't know enough about the history of capital punishment, especially in the South. We know much more about extra-legal punishments like lynching than we do capital punishment. There have been tons and tons of books and studies on lynching in American life from almost every possible angle, and I'm complicit in that output. But there's been relatively little about legal punishment, surprisingly little, even though historically the former states of the Confederacy executed a much larger number of people than other states. And in the modern era, those former Confederate states have executed more people than all other states combined. Yet Michael's book is the only study of capital punishment in the South in the 19th century and the early 20th century. That's phenomenal. Two, this book is important because it argues for what we call Southern distinctiveness against current trends in the field, which have downplayed regional differences in order to highlight how white supremacy operated nationwide. But Michael unabashedly says, no, the South did this differently. And it did this differently because white supremacy took a particularly pernicious form in the South. And third, finally, it's incredibly well researched. Michael collected data on 1,300 executions, and he uses that data to undermine some assumptions we have about capital punishment in the South. For example, he shows that capital punishment did not come to replace or substitute lynching, as lynching declined, as many people have argued. He says these were independent practices and they both hit their peaks simultaneously. And he overturns the assumption that public executions were harsher than private executions. He shows that they were not. And he does that by analyzing the role of religion in public executions, which granted Black Southerners a certain degree of cultural authority, an authority that they lost when executions became private. And that's the crux of his argument. And I'm not going to say much more about that because I'm sure that Michael and Carol will be discussing that. So with that, I'll turn things over to Carol. And again, congratulations. And I look forward to the conversation.
Hey, thank you, Amy. I would like to echo Amy's sentiments that I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation and to talk with Michael about the discoveries he's made in this very important book. And hopefully the audience will find it enlightening and want to read more. So Michael, I want to begin by asking you how you came to this topic. What inspired or motivated you to write a book about capital punishment in the South?
Thank you so much, Carol, and thanks for being a part of this. And to Amy and Claire, I'm so glad this is being recorded in the dark nights of the soul when I'm wondering why I'm doing any of this. I'm going to listen to your words again. Those were just lovely. Thank you. My first book was on the press and sensationalism in the South, looking at narratives of murder cases, actually. And the last chapter in that book dealt with how so many of those murder stories ended, which were at the gallows. And so even with that project, I started wading into this material and realizing, as Amy was saying, that it was very peculiar that I wasn't finding secondary sources that were telling me much about capital punishment in the South. And that led me to start asking questions as I was finishing off that book about what are these changes that I'm seeing? I look at a series of different cases and they're very different in how they end at the gallows, public executions to private ones, to electrocution in the bowels of a penitentiary. And so that's what drew me in, is that my previous project sort of opened a number of questions that I couldn't answer. And that's what started me off.
Well, tell us a little bit more about what were some of those questions that were driving you forward.
Yeah, so the things that I was reading were particularly ones that were showing how lynching was rising and then falling as capital punishment was then rising. And so there was a connection between the two. And I was certainly discovering that in both cases, it was largely African-American men who were being convicted of crimes and executed legally, as well as those who are being extra legally lynched. And so a lot of scholars were talking about how do these two things interact? And I was interested in those questions as well. In truth, most of the questions I started with, I ended up abandoning. That is to say, I thought this was going to be a much more quantitative study than it ended up being. I thought this was going to be showing how lynching and public executions were working alongside of each other, whereas what I ended up finding is that they're really very different experiences. And so part of why it took me so long to write is that I had to not only do the research and do the writing, I had to reconceptualize what I was doing as I was going.
So that discovery about this sort of kind of cross relationship between lynching and legal executions, is that what propelled you to sort of reframe what you initially thought you'd be doing?
Yeah, this morning, as I was thinking about this, I was returning to, I always have a file that's just called Reflections. That's just a sort of journal of my writing, whatever it is I'm writing. And I went in the first 4 pages of that journal, the first couple of months of working on the project, I didn't mention religion once. I thought it was going to be about other things. And then I have this question in the middle of page 4. What about Black religion that I'm seeing everywhere? And that's when I started to ask other questions of what's going on in these moments at the gallows that might not be in line with what white authorities in the South want punishment to be. So it was in the midst of the project that I start building what ends up being the most interesting finding of the book. So.
Well, that was my next question. What was your sort of biggest, kind of that aha moment that we all sort of wait for when we're doing this kind of research? Tell me about that.
Yeah. So in terms of the research, the first sort of surprise that I found is just how casual everybody was about this violence. And so I would see headlines that were like a necktie exhibit for a legal execution, for a hanging, or he was duly Fridayed. A lot of the executions were on Fridays. And so it was just using this sort of lingo of, just sort of casual, there's somebody dying here and you're being so almost flippant about it. And so that was certainly an early surprise that death and public engagement with these deathly moments were just part of what was happening at this time, and was people were casual about. The most unexpected thing has to be, though, the accumulative understanding of how religion was so central to all of these moments. So I started off thinking it was more or less a fig leaf, a sort of form you go through as you do this rote kind of a thing. But the more I was reading and the more elaborate were the descriptions of African-American men and African-American preachers on the scaffold, bearing their hearts and saying things about their sins and about going home to the many mansioned home of I'll see you all in heaven. And then the crowd, the descriptions of the crowd responding and singing hymns along with the African-American ministers. It just started, that was jarring for me. When I was thinking about, this is the era of Jim Crow segregation. This is the era in which African Americans are not given much public authority. And here are 2 men on this stage in front of thousands of people, white and Black, male and female, who were leading the audience in what's in essence a celebration of the good death of the penitent saved. And that's just really not what I was thinking I was going to be finding. And when I was finding it over and over again, framed in different ways by different editors in different decades and so forth, it became just more and more what I came to understand is the story here.
So the audiences for these public events, whether we're talking about, I think, a public execution sort of prior to this shift, or sometimes, as Amy's written about so magnificently, lynchings as well. They all kind of have these can have these kind of ritualized, spectacular aspects to them. And people are witnessing them, they're participating in them. I mean, obviously the what you just described for Black audiences and Black participants is, very meaningful for them. But what about how do the differences span across the audiences? Because you've got, different people who are coming for different reasons. What are other reasons that people are attending these events? I was just reading earlier today with something else about an execution around the turn of the century in North Carolina. And, the folks who were there, there was sort of a spontaneous baseball game while they were waiting for the event to happen. So people are coming to these kinds of things for a lot of different reasons. What other reasons did you find?
So I think you're right that it can be very complex. And one thing that I sort of lay out early in the book is that I'm looking at 1,200 counties in the South, and I'm looking over 60 years. And so that's, in theory, hundreds of sheriffs who are the ones in charge of these different lynchings, and hundreds of different individual crimes and communities responding to them differently. And so there isn't just one thing that happens at these executions. Speaking not in terms of lynching, but in terms of the legal, you have a trial, you are condemned to death, and then it's a public execution, these legal executions. The crowds, absolutely, at times there is an almost festive set of descriptions, which can, be off-putting to us who aren't in an era in which this happens. But I think the simplest explanation for that is it's one of the largest crowds that any of these people are ever going to be a part of. So a religious revival can be a whole lot of people. State fair, maybe a whole lot of people. Very few other moments, especially in rural parts of the South, are you going to have thousands of people in one place at one time. And so will you have people selling barbecue and, drinks and whatever, taking advantage of the crowd? It's a capitalist country after all. Yeah. So that will be a part of what's going on. Could there be along the side some sort of sideshow entertainment? Somebody doing that could be down the road somewhere, taking advantage of all the people that are in town. But what I was finding in the descriptions of these execution moments is the way in which they were treating it as if it was a camp meeting, a religious revival. And so there would be descriptions of sometimes people speaking in tongues and rolling around on the ground in the crowds, like you might overcome by the emotion of the spirit at a camp meeting. That there would be a call and response between those on the scaffold, the ministers on the scaffold, sometimes there's multiple ministers, and the crowd. So it was participatory. It was not just a condemned and a minister trying to make this moment into something larger. The crowd was participating in that as well. And so mostly that's what I was finding. The religious element was really a significant part of the sort of normal execution. There are ones that are different than that, but what's the sort of baseline average execution? It's going to be like that, with the religious service at the gallows being a central feature.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to something that you've talked about a little bit in our conversation already, but I'm interested in this in trying to tease out this relationship between extra-legal lynchings and legalized execution as punishment by the state. What do you think is in terms of sort of the cultural function or the cultural work that these two, events do? What's the relationship between them?
I see, and this is not at all the place where I started. I started in a very different place. And so it was an evolution as I got deeper and deeper into the primary sources. They just convinced me that I had it wrong when I was first thinking about the project. But I see the private executions that are phased in over the course of several decades in the South, just as they were in the North in an earlier period and in the West in an earlier period. Ones behind walls, without the crowds, without the African-American ministers and the condemned preaching on the scaffold, where in these enclosures are only white people, generally speaking. And then especially once you get electrocution, which is a very limited number of people, it's in a room, in a prison, very limited number of people who are there. They are going to be white people. So I see private executions being much more like lynchings, where it's quite clearly controlled by the white authorities and the African-American person, and more than 80% of all those executed in the South was African-American. That's why I keep saying this. It was the norm. Were within a white event. Public executions I see as the authorities wanting it to be chastening, to be something that is teaching a lesson not just to the person who committed the crime, but to the whole society. This is what happens when you commit murder or something like that. And yet what the event actually ends up being is a sheriff on the scaffold for sure, but the minister on the scaffold is a Black man in the post-Civil War period. The condemned is Black, the audience is half Black, or something like that. And the event is really quite conflicted with a lot of references to being saved and a lot of references to we are all sinners, sort of baseline Protestant understandings of Christianity. And then it's only the grace of God that saves us, and we have to throw ourselves on the mercy of God. And here is a sinner who is throwing himself on the mercy of God. Praise the Lord. And so that's not like a lynching, which is a vicious, often, expression of white antipathy, and there's often torture involved of the body before and after they are killed, and the audience is almost always white. And so that's a really distinct dynamic. Are they both public? Are there people watching? Does it include death? In all those sort of categorical ways, they're similar. But in terms of the cultural work, as you were saying, in terms of the dynamics, I see them as really different.
Of course, we still have legal executions in this country, in some states in this country. Do you think the culture of capital punishments today still retains some of these earlier sort of vestiges of this kind of religious work?
That's really interesting. Good question.
I mean, because I was sort of thinking, right, because a lot of times you'll see an execution take place, and of course the crowd, or there might be a crowd gathered outside, and they have signs. And it does have a sort of festive, somewhat quality to it oftentimes that I personally find incredibly distasteful, but reading your book, really caused me to sort of think about this in a new way. Yeah. But I was just wondering what thoughts you had about the way capital punishment is carried out.
These are just going to be thoughts rather than a part of my study and me speaking with any sort of authority. I don't know if you remember, but there was a daytime TV host who offered to show live on TV an execution. He was an anti-capital punishment person, and he believed this was a way to try to get people to be against capital punishment, is to broadcast it. And of course, he was turned down. The Oklahoma bombing, one of the people who was executed, it was on closed circuit TV for the families of the victims. they were allowed to watch him die. So other than that, these events just really aren't, it's not in the realm of what we talk about to have them be public. And so, lethal injection, problems with drugs, the issues of the mental health of the people who are being executed. There are all kinds of really substantive issues that are problems with how we do capital punishment now. Of course, I actually have a problem with there being capital punishment at all. So there's that. But in terms of the religious side, there is just no information since 1936 when the last public execution happened on how the public would respond. So I'm at a loss there a little bit. How much would the religious side of this continue?
That's interesting. That's interesting. I think, we've got a few more minutes left, and I have one final question I wanted to ask you about your writing process.
Sure.
You mentioned in the acknowledgments to the book that you kind of went through a period, I don't know if you would describe it as writer's block, but, after your parents passed away. And so I'm just, as, someone who, as a writer, and we all have life happens, right, while you're trying to get these projects done. I'm interested to hear how you overcame that. Where did you find the motivation to get back into the work, especially, both you and I, and me as well, when we tend to write about stuff that's so kind of depressing and morbid?
Yeah, all three of us have books out there that are pretty hard reads. So yeah, so this is pre-COVID, by the way. So in post-COVID times, when people talk about their parents dying, people might think that's what it was. It was in 2013 and 2015, so quite a while ago. And there was a decline for my dad and then for my mom. And so it wasn't just a moment and a shock, it was a process. And studying, I'm actually writing a piece for Perspectives Daily that's about this. And one of the things I say in that is, imagine for a moment that I'm trying to remember an execution that happened in Tennessee, where Dr. Barry's pain pills was a sign that was tagged up onto the gallows. What a horrific use of advertising in a public execution. And I have to turn away from my computer and turn to my files and go to my Tennessee files, and then leaf through photocopy after photocopy of executions to find the right one. That's just a lot of death. That's just a lot to deal with. And in those moments when my parents were not doing well and had passed away, it was just too much. And so I spent 4 years tinkering, working around the edges, doing what I could, but really not being able to focus on the project. The thing that got me back into it, there isn't a secret. There's not like a trick or anything that I had. It's simply the fact that at the core of this project is a really interesting historical intellectual question about the place of executions and the place of religion in executions that I was literally really interested to pursue. And so that pulled me along back into what's the best way to tell this story and so forth.
Okay. Is there anything else? Is there a question you wished I had asked you that you want to talk about, or you want people to know about the book?
Wow, that's a really good question. I've just been so focused on each thing that you've been asking. My mind is sort of blank with other issues. Just give me 1 second.
Well, I'm sure the audience will have plenty of questions, which we're going to move to briefly in just a second after you respond.
Yeah. Well, let's just go ahead to those questions. Yeah.
All right, sounds good. Please raise your hand and let's have some questions. Okay, hi. Allison? What is your question?
Yeah, so I this is a lot to process. A lot of things that I've been thinking about. And I was wondering on your take on some of the, like, in the past it was a racist act to do a lynching. It was something that was racist and also religious, but also now that I know that. But also now there's a higher amount of Black people in jails
Yeah.
because of this need for, is it more racism? And I know it's not quite connected, but I'm drawing connections between some of the ideals from your book and your history and the ideals of these times.
Yeah, thank you. I like that question. And I would say the lynchings, the extra legal executions, there can be a religious element there, a white religious element. And Donald Matthews has written a really good book on that and several articles. With the legal executions and the religion that I'm talking about, looking much more at African-American religion and the way in which that was influencing those events. That's a little bit of a different thing. So here's what happens over the 20th century. Let me bring you from the period that I'm talking about up to where we are now. All of the South transitions to electrocutions, and capital punishment numbers go down and down and down until the 1960s. There's just like 1 a year and then 0 a year. And then the Supreme Court actually says it is cruel and unusual punishment to have capital punishment. And there's a moratorium nationwide. States then rejigger the way that they do capital punishment. And there's a burst of new executions and death row expands and so forth up until 1999. And now it's falling again. And so in 1999, there were 98 executions, I think it was. We're averaging more like 16, 17 a year now. It's gone way down. And so it's entirely possible that we're moving in the direction of not being a nation that uses capital punishment anymore. And there are states that have put moratoriums on stopping them. There are states like Virginia, the first state in the South ever to end capital punishment. They've done away with capital punishment. So there's some change that's taking place, and some change recently that's been taking place on capital punishment. Lynching went down and just about went away in the 1930s, 40s. It's not that racial violence went away, but these sorts of events that are like this went away. The prison issue rises like crazy in the 1960s and 70s, in part because of a number of rising crime, but in part because changing drug laws that just put so many more people in prison, and racism is absolutely a part of that process. So you're absolutely right. I see differences there. I see more comparisons between the prison populations and the way the South had convict lease and prison farms in the same period that we're talking about. But race and justice and violence are a part of our world right now, and they were a part of the world 100 years ago.
Okay, I think we have a question from August.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking. My question is actually for either or both of you. So I'm, and I'm sure a lot of other people who are here are too. I want to be a filmmaker, and I'm interested in exploring some of what you guys are covering just in terms of history. So I wanted to get your perspective on just some of the art you've seen that explores difficult topics like this. It's very easy to glamorize, but Yeah, I guess I just wanted to get your perspective on just the importance of portraying that in art, whether it's nonfiction books like the ones that you guys write or fictional narratives.
I'll start, and if you have any thoughts, Carol, you can add in. I have been so inundated by the nonfiction that I've been doing, the primary sources that I have to say that I have not explored fictional works as much. I do find that there is a really fine line that is really hard to negotiate between honoring the pain and horror of this sort of topic, and not making it a sort of violence pornography, a sort of exploration of violence for the sake of shocking, and in that way using a history that is real and painful in a way that might not be the most appropriate, you know. So I'm leery of how difficult it can be to walk that line, is one of the things that comes to my mind.
Yeah, I would echo what Michael has to say, and that if you're wanting to sort of educate yourself about some of these issues, following the conversations scholars and artists have had about lynching photography and lynching photographs, and Amy Wood's book on lynching and spectacle will be a great place to start about that. You know, there's a very kind of long, Michael's got it there, conversation about the role of these photographs and souvenir photographs that were taken at the time, but also the way that historians and other scholars use them in their work to recreate the past and talk about the history and the problems that can cause. So that's one place I would start. Okay, let's see here. Get your name, Jonah. I think we have a question from you.
You're muted. You're still muted. There you go.
Hi, sorry, it wasn't allowing me at the
go.
beginning. Thank you so much for being here, and congratulations on your book. It
Thanks.
doesn't seem like an easy finish, but but I was kind of curious. It seems like globally speaking, there was like in the history, public executions weren't just specific to the United States. It was like all over the place. It seemed like commonplace almost, and nowadays I don't think that's the case. So I wanted to inquire about the global move away from public lynchings, if there's sort of a consensus or like a unheard of consensus that we all kind of decided that it was immoral and disturbing.
Yeah. A really good question. And of course, every culture is different and evolves in its own way and so forth. And with those sorts of caveats, in the 19th century, in the 1800s, most European nations are moving away from public executions. And you might have images or thoughts of a guillotine in France in the French Revolution. Well, that's the 1790s and early 1800s. That's not later. And there are, in a similar kind of a way, lynching is a word that comes out of the American context, the United States context, but there are things like that, the sort of illegal group killings of people that go on around the world. And so there are these sorts of relations. But it is a very disturbing thing to have public executions. And I think as societies became more and more focused on civility and middle-class values, I think these sorts of things did just fade away.
All right, thank you, Jonah. Lawrence, we have a question.
Yes, actually, it's more of a comment. I've learned recently that several Western states have plan to renew execution by firing squad. I'd like Michael's response to that.
Yeah. So there have been a variety of different, I can say all kinds of gross things. So there have been a variety of different ways to do this, and they've been experimented with in different states. And so hanging was really the only one that was used, I think, by any Southern state and any state that I know about in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century. Colorado experimented, believe it or not, with a sort of reverse hanging. That is to say, a person starts on the ground with a noose on, and there's a counterweight, and it, instead of a fall, you have a lifting them up thing. And I don't know why this was supposed to be better, but they experimented with that, believe it or not. It's crazy. Firing squad became, especially in the West, something that would be used. And then, of course, as of the 30s, 40s, 50s, lethal injection started to be the way that more and more states were turning. It has to do with humanitarian concerns, usually. Hangings could be very gruesome, and I'm not going to go into that, but let's just say almost all the time the sheriff is doing his first hanging. And so not knowing exactly how much slack to leave, whatever, could not, it's possible to not have it be successful. Electrocution could be pretty gross too. But firing squad, in theory, could be immediate. Somebody would die as long as they were hit correctly. And that's usually the way that people are arguing in, you have to pass a bill. So there's a legislative track record of what the debates were and so forth. And that's usually what they're arguing, is that this is more humane.
Stephen, what is your question?
Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Michael. Good to see you. I've been thinking about the prominent killings of Black people in the past number of years, and the two responses that seem to come from it. One is often lots of people standing outside the courthouse demanding justice, demanding retribution, perhaps. And then on the other hand, I was just listening to Michael Eric Dyson talk the other day, and he was saying that, for example, in Charleston, almost all of the family members of the people who were killed in Charleston, their immediate response was forgiveness. Right, and both of
You're talking about the Charleston church shooting.
Yes.
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 I remember that one, and that was really notable to me.
Yeah. I guess I'm wondering, with the sort of strong religious element in some of these public executions, lynchings that you're talking about in the 19th century, how did that tension play out? Because both, there's demands for retribution and demands for forgiveness in the Christian Bible very strongly, right?
Yeah. Great question. And let me complicate it just a little bit by talking about how there is a crime that's committed, let's say. There is someone who is apprehended. There is a trial that takes place. Maybe there's an appeal, maybe there's not. And then later there's an execution, if there's an execution. And so the public response can be really different at those different moments. And the one that this book is studying is that last moment. And the sources that I've got and that I build, the 1,300 cases and the newspaper reports and so forth that I build this book out of, is the last one. And a lot of the moments where you would have people angry and demanding vengeance might be when the person is arrested or when the person is on trial. And so I think that was happening a lot back in this day too. But then in the moment when someone is about to have their last minutes on earth and meet their maker, and all of this, there opens up a sort of space in which this religious ceremony becomes something that a lot of people thought was appropriate, rather than just responding out of vengeance. That said, there are cases that I cover in my book that are very vengeful. Sort of exceptions to the norm, places where it's hard to distinguish, is this a legal execution or is this a lynching? Because the crowd is acting like it wants to see this guy die. There weren't many of those that I found, but there were some that I found.
Hey, we have a question
Jefferson
from Jefferson.
Cowie.
Good to see you, Michael.
Good to see you, Jeff.
You're one of the nicest guys I know. You go to some dark places. Earlier on, in response to someone else's question, you said something about the rise of middle-class values change things. And my limited exposure to some of this violence, it's often the best people who are involved in this, you know, the town's finest. So I wonder if you could reflect maybe a little bit on the class dynamics of this for both Black and white people in the sort of public execution realm.
Imagine you talking to me about class, Jeff. That's just
Whoa.
crazy.
Really
Jeff Cowie is a historian and has worked quite a bit on class as well as on the South now. He's got a great book out himself, and you should look him up. Great question. And the crowds that I'm seeing are really cross-class crowds. And so what you're saying about the best people, absolutely, in terms of leaders of the community, in the Black community, the ministers would be considered among the best people, and they're right there on the scaffold. So I hear what you're saying. And sometimes in lynching crowds, you have the best people involved in those as well. But what I'm finding is that when you have public executions, there are no walls, there are no doors. You aren't kept out. And so who shows up is just about everybody. And so they talk about crowds of every hue. They talk about being surprised there are as many white women in the audience as there are, and so forth. And so it doesn't seem like these are especially oriented in the direction of it being the better sort going to these public events. Now, once you get private executions, it is, in the words of one observer, a professional audience. And you've got doctors there and lawyers there and newspaper editors there. And it becomes a really completely different thing. If only 15 people are allowed to see an execution, you've got this person, this person, this person, you know, and it's very curated. What I did find is once you have a wall of any sort, and let me describe a couple of the weird walls that you have. Here are some supposedly private executions: a barbed wire fence 4 feet high, a strand of rope, a gallows that's totally out in the open, but around the bottom of the gallows is tenting, canvas tenting, so that someone falls through and actually dies behind a barrier, but the theater of the gallows happens all in front. So all kinds of weird arrangements for this to be supposedly private when it really isn't. But once you get any kind of a wall, once you get any type of a barrier, then it's the sheriff who is determining who gets in. And that's when you get all kinds of decisions being made about class and race and gender. And so a lot of notices about a large group of Negroes are on the outside, clearly not being let in. And that no women were present except for the victim of the rape herself, who wanted to witness him die, or something like that. That makes sense?
Yeah. Thanks for doing this work, Michael. It's important.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, I think it's time now for us to move to final thoughts. I'm being told.
I want to hear Amy's question.
Okay, let's go then. Let's go with Amy's question. I do too.
Well, sorry, I thought there was still time, but so I thought, and I didn't see other hands up, so I thought I would ask a question.
Please.
But I think what's really fascinating about your study is the ways in which you show that Black ministers and Black condemned people had this public stage, as you said. And I was wondering why that ends up imparting messages that go against a kind of white supremacist, right? They're allowing the Black criminal to have redemption and grace. And it's going against the message of the intention of the execution in a way. So I was wondering why you think white authorities would have allowed that.
That's a really good question. And of course, ultimately, they don't allow that, in that there's a movement to end it. So in the antebellum period, it would have been a white minister. And certainly there were, dating back to Puritan execution sermons in New England, there's a long tradition of having these moments be sort of moments of religious thought and talking about how everyone is a sinner and look what can happen to you and so forth. And so you can imagine that those executions were more chastising, that the Bible passages chosen, the hymns chosen were more, I am a sinner and I get what I deserve, or something like that. In the wake of the Civil War, there's almost an immediate movement of African Americans out of white churches and into their own churches. And now you have ministers on the scaffold in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, who are African American ministers who are giving a different theology, really, who are focused more on redemption and on the grace of God and less on chastising. And that's exactly when you start getting editorials and people working to make executions private. When did Virginia make them private? 1879. When did Georgia? 1893. And so there's a sort of generation in which you have all of this ferment of legislative activity to end public executions in just the moment when African Americans are taking that stage and having that sort of an anti-white supremacist, very public, black and white crowd in the era of Jim Crow authority. And that's taken away from them.
Okay, we need to move on to final thoughts. I'll go first and leave the final thought to Michael. My final thought is this is such a kind of powerful, well-researched and thoughtful book about a problem that historians have grappled with, and if you're interested as a reader in really sort of delving into this issue and seeing, what it's looked like over time, then Michael's book is definitely, one you should read. Michael.
Thank you so much for that. I would simply say very briefly, first of all, thanks to Claire, who I've leaned on for more than 20 years and thankfully is now my dean. Amy and Carol, both of your books were really important in me thinking through violence and race in this period. And I'm so pleased that you've joined me here. And thanks to FLEF and to PCIM for putting this all together. It's really been a pleasure. We are surrounded today by a society in which there is violence, in which there is inequality in our policing, inequality in our prison system, in which we are striving to become better. And yet, as I say in my book, I did not write this with any sort of a desire to have this book have echoes to today, but with the rise of some white supremacist sentiment in the last decade, there are too many haunting things that I was reading about from the 1890s that I can read about in the news as well. One of the things that this book can teach you, and that I hope this conversation has helped with, is how much things do change. It is not that we're living back in the South in the 1890s. We are living with racism. We are living with issues of prisons that are overflowing. We have challenges all around us, but we don't have the same challenges that they had in the 1890s. And this book describes some of those changes that start happening in that period. Thank you.
And thank you, Michael. I'm Patty Zimmerman. I'm the director of FLEF, and I'm here to close us out by first thanking Carol and Amy and Claire for their beautiful comments and questions. So beautifully rendered and so deep. And of course, congratulations to my wonderful colleague, Michael Trotti, on the publication and this international launch of The End of Public Execution. I'd like to ask all our participants now to unmute their microphones, and I'd like everyone to give a big round of bravos and claps to Michael Trotti to celebrate the end of public execution.
Congrats.
Yay, Michael.
Yay.
Hey, Beth.
Excellent presentation, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Carol.
Keep moving.
Yeah. That's right.
Okay, as you realize, we're still live, so we'll wait a minute for people to leave. Okay, I think we're all here, Leah. Take it away.
So thank you so
Thanks,
much
all of you.
for such a fantastic event. We had really interesting questions, and I think the chat was full of really fascinating quotes. So I want to first thank Allison, Jeremy, and Hannah for manning the chat so thoughtfully.